we're going to record this just for our own records. And if we might post to share, if you have objections to for us posting and share this, please let me know. So just to get started, so I'm Marie Bigham. I'm the founder of Accept and one of the three co-leaders. Steve Frappier and Brandy Smith are co-leaders with me, and we're thrilled that everyone's here today. So as I was finishing this up, just some thoughts about when they see us. Personally, I love thinking about films, and I love thinking about filmmaking and storytelling, and I get a little too in my head and intellectualized when it comes to film, it's craft and art, and I tend to get lost in things. And then as soon as I finish watching something, I immediately run to the internet and look up as much critique as I can so I feel smart because my interpretation is right, blah, 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 right? And it's just it's an obnoxious and overthinking way of approaching media. And that didn't happen as I was watching When They See Us. It's a rare moment, but I was so captivated. And someday I hope that I will be able to have that distance and to be able to step back and to watch this piece as that visual masterpiece and work of art and craft that it really is. But I think at this moment that would be a real injustice, because this story is so captivating and infuriating and sob-inducing and alarmingly familiar and so beautifully told that my reactions to this weren't intellectual. They were visceral and they were emotional. And even though I grew up at this time, I remember this playing out in the news so vividly, and I watched the Ken Burns documentary. Something about this, the telling of this story this way really just shook me to the core. And I think it was during the first episode, towards the very beginning, when the boys go into the park for the first time. That was the moment where this punched me in the gut. Because April of 1989, I was turning 16. I'm an April baby. So I was turning 16 that month. And as soon as that scene flashed on of those kids riding their bikes into the park and the song Fight the Power by Public Enemy playing, that immediately in that moment took me back to my own teenage years in suburban St. Louis. And that joy and that feeling of freedom and being out in one of the first warm nights and just making dumb teenage mayhem while running through the park, and that majestic Public Enemy music playing in the background. In that moment, I was right back there at that moment. And then it immediately came crashing down because I realized just as quickly that none of the young men depicted in this film were going to feel that moment of freedom and teenage joy ever again. And that was that visceral punch in the gut. So thanks all for coming today. I just want to express my gratitude to everyone here for engaging in this really important work. To Brandy Smith always for her love and care and attention, but for planning this and for leading this conversation. To the majestic Ms. Ava DuVernay, the director and producer of this masterpiece, and to all the artists who brought this story to life with such tremendous care and sensitivity. And most of all, thank you to the Exonerated Five, to Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, Yusuf Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise for allowing this story to be told. Before we start, we have, just want to share some community norms. I've put them into the chat group as well, but some pretty basic things that we try to follow and accept. We ask you to stay engaged and to listen to understand, not to respond. When you speak your truth and use the I perspective, and participate to the best of your ability. This is a tough discussion. There are going to be moments of discomfort, but like the wristband says, you join Accept for the activism, but you stay for the discomfort. Expect and accept non-disclosure, or non-closure rather, and appreciate and acknowledge what people say, even if it's difficult to hear it and receive it. Brandy's going to lead our discussions tonight, and I'm going to post the questions that Brandy and I discussed into the chat. And Brandy, take it over, girl.
Thanks. Thanks, guys, for joining. I know everybody has a lot going on, but I think this is a really important topic. And so I'm going to throw out just a few questions, because I don't think we need to throw out a lot of questions, because I think we're going to have some pretty healthy discussion. But as I watched, we thought about like sort of doing separate webinars to talk about each episode because there's so much to unpack. And we'll see based on how this goes if we decide we want to do some more per episode. But to get things started, the first question that I wanted to ask was, what were some of your initial thoughts after watching episode 1, but then after watching all 4 parts? I can say for myself, the first episode was probably the hardest to sort of get through. There were some times where I had to like pause and take a break. And I'll be honest, and there were times where I was like, I don't know that I can go back to it. I had a good friend who quickly reminded me that while it was hard to watch, I had to remember that these 5 kids actually lived through it. And so that kept me like coming back to it. And then by the time I got to episode 4, there was just sort of this overwhelming sadness for both what happened to the 5 of them, but also to see where we are, where our current social climate is, and not that much hasn't really changed, and that could be any of the students that we all serve. That could be a brother, a cousin, and so for me, that really was pretty profound. So I'd love to just sort of get it started with sort of that simple question. If someone would like to share sort of how some of their initial reactions about it.
Remember that to unmute yourself, the Zoom automatically mutes you when you log in before you answer. And if you could also tell us your name and your institution. Thanks.
Well, I guess I'll get us started. This is Kenneth Welch from Prescott College in Prescott, Arizona. Initially, when I watched it, the first episode, not even the first episode, just the intro in and of itself, I was taken back to being a young kid. And even though I'm a little bit younger than the gentlemen who were associated with it, I still put myself in their shoes. And I always talk about, personally where I come from, Youngstown, Ohio, things like this, maybe not to the extreme, but there's targets out on young African-American, brown, minoritized peoples. So I look at it as that could have been me, first and foremost. I look at that could have been my son, now that I have one. And it was just so much to kind of go through. And it was one of those things where it's like, I don't even want to watch this. This is ridiculous. But on the same token, how could I not pay attention to it? Now that I work for a program that enrolls people in social justice and community organizing, it's like, this is not just for me for research for my job, but this is real life. And it was just so much. I mean, even now thinking about it, it's one of those things. It's like, I tell anybody, if you have color, if you don't have color, watch this, because it really gives you a different scope and the reality and how law enforcement works, in and around the communities that are minoritized, that are consistently targeted. So I'll just leave it at that. I just felt a sense of like pain and anger and frustration. And even at the end, when you're exonerated, and like you had kind of mentioned, looking at what's going on now, the lady Linda Feinstein, or however you pronounce her name, is still sticking to her guns years and years and years later. And it's still frustrating, but I guess it kind of is what it is. I'm out.
Thank you for sharing, Kenneth. Belinda, do you mind sharing? I think you've shared some pretty profound statements about this as the mother of 2 Black sons. And so it's been really interesting to hear your take on it.
Okay, Belinda Wilkerson. I'm an independent in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So this really, when I first started watching it, I had to turn it off and go do something else. And I came back to it like maybe 4 days later, because for the last 9 years, I haven't lived near my sons. So I have 2 sons, one 38 and one 34. And all that reminded me of is that no matter what, I can't protect my sons. I remember when that happened. I remember when my youngest son was getting his driver's license, and I had to talk to him about driving while black, and he thought I was making it up. He thought it was a big joke. Oh my, you're just out there. And then a month later, when my 6'3", 17-year-old comes home, completely broken, in tears because he had been pulled over for no reason other than being black, and I couldn't fix that. And watching that brought all of that up for me. And then watching episode 4, especially watching Corey's story and knowing that he was just trying to be a friend and got caught up in somebody else's pain and madness. And then thinking about, Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and all the other names. And I said, I knew that I couldn't talk about this to anybody white because I would probably want to smack somebody if they said something stupid. And that's not my nature to do that. But I knew, because as a mom, I kept saying, I can't protect my kids. This could still happen to one of my sons today. This could still happen to one of my sons today, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. And that's scary as hell.
Yeah, I think that's so real. I mean, and I think that's what's scary for a lot of us, right? Like that could happen to a lot of us. I am interested because I've seen some people's comments. And I'm now at a place where I can like receive it, but I am interested to sort of know like how did white people interpret this? I mean, I think for most of the people of color that I've spoken to, they're like, I've had experiences like this. Like I think a few days ago, Jim Rollins even posted about an admissions officer being pulled over by the police, and it was really based off the color of their skin. So for the white people who watch the series, like, tell us a little bit about your take.
Hi. Can I jump in? Can you all hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I put myself
Okay.
on mute.
Hi,
Yeah,
sorry. I'm Laura Metzler. I'm with Florida Gulf Coast University. I've been having my video and my volume muted because I have some other things going on, but I didn't want to miss this opportunity, and I want to thank you all for organizing this. But just personally myself, I was able to watch it with my husband, who also works in higher ed at FGCU, and I think it hit me a little personally as well because my father is a police officer. So I'm constantly trying to show him that while I see him as a good cop, there's so many that are not, and cannot leave their bias out of situations, and just kind of, helping him maybe understand that and see, that these stereotypes are out there, and that while I might be, pulled over and not have a situation like this happen to me, or have an, conversation with a police officer, not have that, my friends might be experiencing something that I'm not experiencing, and just like getting him to see that there is bias within his, even in his department, and just trying to be an ally myself. And I just think too, watching it because of, and Brandy, you and I kind of talked a little bit about this on Facebook, that these were kids. Just, we work with students their age, and just, seeing how that could be one of my students that I help, and not being able to help them.
Mm-hmm. I'll jump in. I'm Lucy Smith. Can you guys hear me?
Yep. Hey, Lucy.
Okay, great. Hi. And I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, at Charlotte Latin School. What a lot to digest was my overall reaction to the docuseries. I thought that, the first episode, I mean, I was sick to my stomach the entire time, not because I was in disbelief that these kinds of things happen, because obviously they do. We've seen them. I was like maybe 6 when all of this went down, so I don't really remember. I mean, I had no recollection actually. Didn't really know the story until I watched the show. But I mean, obviously we know that things like this still happen, and that is incredibly upsetting and disturbing and just flat out wrong. I think that Ava DuVernay said it so well in the Oprah interview after the fact, that the social justice system is not broken. It was built this way. And that has resonated with me so much. I sobbed through episode 4, just sobbed through it. I felt for all of the men or the boys at the time, but especially Corey. I've reflected a lot on what would I have done if I were on the jury, you know, because we're seeing the series for what took place behind the scenes. And so I try to put myself, okay, if I were on the jury and I'm being fed certain facts, how would I react? Because I think that's part of the social justice system is, or the criminal, well, maybe not criminal justice, but the system, the legal system, is, you know, what happens in the courtroom. And, you know, of just being a woman, of course, I would have wanted justice for the victim. However, I really, truly hope that I would not have been blinded, that would not have blinded me to the falsification of facts. I mean, there was nothing to corroborate any of the stories, you know, other than the fake confessions, the forced confessions. Outside of that, there was nothing to corroborate anything. It was all falsified, and I hope that I would have been able to see that.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yes, Maria's waving, so yes.
Hey,
My
Lisa.
name is Lisa Sommer. I'm an independent counselor, but I was in the school for more than 20 years too. I was a 25-year-old in Manhattan when this happened, and so watching it for me, I mean, my first thing was I kept finding myself over and over saying, but that's not what they were telling us. That's not what they were telling us. It was, in the reporting at the time was so different. And I felt like people at that time used these children to try to bring out the worst that everybody thought about everything in the city. It was designed so much. There was so much done to make people afraid and to believe what they were being told, and to look at it now as someone who has spent so much time working with kids of this same age and understanding how they were trapped and they were tricked and they were used by the system and punished in a way that exoneration can't make it go away. I mean, I was amazed at the end. Okay, I watched it in 2 pieces because I was afraid that if I stopped watching, I wouldn't be able to turn it back on. So I kind of kept going for as long as I could. And I couldn't believe the lasting humanity of these boys who had grown up to be men, and their ability to create lives where so much conspired to take their lives away from them. So I look back on that time and I said, I mean, obviously I didn't go so far, Lucy, to think about being on the jury, but you know, I did go back and think about what we were all being told here at that time. You know, because for us it was sort of a local story. That's it.
Can I jump in?
Hey, Marissa. Yeah.
Hey.
Thanks.
So,
Lisa.
I felt angry, sad. You know, it was intense. But the 2 things that really punched me in the gut was I just kept saying to myself, like, I didn't even know the story. Like, I was 10 or whatever when it happened. 30 years later, I never knew the story, and I started just Googling everything, and I was like, how has it been that I didn't even know this happened. And that to me was one of the biggest tragedies and kind of the sadness that I am sitting with as a white woman, is I didn't even know. And how many other things out there do I just not even know because I haven't had to, because it hasn't been in the mainstream media, or it hasn't been in my history books, or it hasn't been in the classrooms, and I just haven't. And that to me is where I'm really struggling since watching the show. And then I came back upstairs and I see my two little boys who will never know that pain. And I'm so struck by what Belinda is saying. It's really sitting heavy with me about the fear that she has as a mom of two Black men, you know, even grown up men now, and still feeling that fear, and that I will never, that privilege that I have of not worrying about my sons having to have that interactions with the justice system, because I just know that that's likely the way it's going to be. And those are the two things that I'm really processing after watching the show last week.
Thanks for sharing, Marissa. I'd love to hear from other people, but one thing I just want to say before I forget it is that like I watched the first episode again, and one of the things that I found interesting, and you guys know I talk about this a lot in Accept and in other groups, is when I think of like the most profound moments in every episode, what I keep coming back to is how the power of Linda's words were able to change the whole trajectory of what happened to those 5 kids. And it made me think a lot about, in her case, I think it was very much like she knew what she was doing, but like how oftentimes, I think sometimes white women realize it, sometimes they don't, about how it is easy for you to uphold white supremacy because people will believe you. Like you just say the right words, you have the right intentions. And to me, that's something that has really stuck with me, is that it's so interesting how she was able to twist. And even though there were several people who were like, nope, that's not right, what you're saying is not right, she was saying it, so they believed it. And I don't know what it's like to like walk through the world, right, where like people just give me the benefit of the doubt. And so to me, that's what's really stuck with me, is that like she had such a profound impact. Her words were that heavy. And then it made me think too that like, even aside from being a white woman, the power of the words we use when we're talking to young people and what we speak into them and the messages we send to them, I think are incredibly important. Like in my school, like we're a school where like the demographics are shifting, right? Like we're 45% African-American, 26% Latinx. And, you know, I think about Raymond and his dad trying to get down to the police station, right? But like the fear of like, I'm going to lose my job and I'm going to have to leave my mother here who doesn't speak much English to help protect my kid from a system that neither one of us really understand. Like that easily could have been one of my kids. And it's 2019. And like, that's just, it's just like, sometimes I feel like we've made such progress. And then there are times where it's like, we haven't. And I just think like, how is it that we can't see the innocence in children, yet so many people can see the innocence in like a Brock Turner, right? Mm-hmm. The Stanford swimmer. Like how is that possible that we choose to pay attention to some things and not? And so those are just some of the things that really stuck with me. And I think, you know, race is definitely a huge part of it, but I think class is also a part of it. And I think, you know, for so long, like we've told students, right? Like education is the key, you know, for a better life for you. But like, let's look at like Yusuf, for example. Yusuf skipped 2 grades. He was highly intelligent. He and Corey still ended up in the same situation. And it's like, it doesn't matter how educated you are, how much money you are, at the end of the day, you're still Black. You're still Latinx. And that is frustrating because it's like many of us have been raised and taught by our parents that like, whether right or wrong, like you got to give 150% when everybody else is given 10%. But like, to what avail? Like when do we get a break?
Brandy, to your point, you saying that about, wittingly or not, how often white women support white supremacy in the system, especially, and the biases that we bring, the assumptions of not treating these kids like they were children, and the biases that we bring. But I think also too the bias that we bring culturally and in society, regardless of who we are, to automatically assume white women are telling the truth. That there is that bias both towards kids of color, but especially Black boys, that they must be criminal, and the assumption always of innocence with white women, that is a really tricky thing to hold. And Lisa, to your point of saying, but this is what we were told, it's what we were cultured to believe, that if that white woman tells you this is what it is, that is what it is, regardless of all that other noise. And Brandy, that to me was one of the things that stood out so much in this, that woman just made up things out of thin air, and it was unimpeachable truth, and that she still clings to that, but that the world believed that too, largely in part because of her class, but that she is a white woman saying it. That was so striking in this. So thanks for bringing that.
And I think that your point, Marie, the fact that there was a white woman
involved. Colin, will you just quickly say who you are and
sorry.
Sorry, it's okay.
My name is Colin Lord, and I've been working in admissions in both college and in boarding schools and day schools for the past 20 years. And I was 18 years old, living in Brooklyn when this happened. And the past couple of weeks have been really interesting because most of the men that I know who live that reality, none of us are watching the series. And it's also interesting because now that I'm older, more mature, I now realize myself and many of my peers, we compartmentalize that whole reality. And just having people talk about the documentary brought back all of these feelings, these emotions, feeling incredibly marginalized when it happened, and feeling afraid because we knew that if it could happen to these brothers, it could happen to us. And I find it also interesting that when the media was doing what the media did, we weren't buying it. Somehow we knew that stuff didn't add up. Somehow we figured out, even at 18 years old, that it just didn't sound right. And we felt like there was a rush to judgment. And yes, I still do remember our current president putting out a full-page ad in the New York Times, which was like a smack in the face back then and in 2016. And so I'm happy that the series was done, because I do think that people need to know what happened and what's possible in a justice system. But in terms of myself and my immediate pick, we're good. We're good. And I'm still amazed at how there seems to be this unanimous this consensus that what was done was wrong. But I just can't help but think to myself, but where were y'all 30 years ago? Because the shit was wrong 30 years ago and we knew it was wrong. But like my grandmother always said, better late than never. So I'm glad that, we're getting to a point where we can, most normal people can understand the injustice that was done to these brothers.
Thank you for organizing this, and it's something I'm really thinking through. I talked about the series with somebody when I was home in Seattle recently. Somebody who
introduce yourself, Aviva.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
I'm Aviva. I work at a Jewish high school called Shalhavet in Los Angeles. I lived in New York when the Exonerated Five were exonerated, and I babysat for a producer of Dateline who had done the story about the woman in the park who had been assaulted. And so I always heard it from her point of view and not from the Exonerated Five points of view. And I also I have thought a lot about story and the power of story. And I posted this, a couple of you have seen, I posted on my personal Facebook page. Somebody who I know well said, I don't really see the point in watching. It was so hard to watch. What was the point in watching? And I think about, in the same way I think about Holocaust movies, like what's the point in watching? Like it's important to know the stories because it personalizes events. I also really struggle with Linda Fairstein, because when I'm being generous, I think that she had a construct in her mind and she could not come up with any other story despite all evidence. Like she just would not divert from the story she had created in her head. And when I talked to this family friend who lived in New York at the time, Linda Fairstein was like the revered prosecutor. That she was somebody who made sex crimes important and that women should be believed. And when Brandy and Marie, when you talk about white feminism and what are the casualties of that, and how it's not enough. And I have really struggled with the intersection of that, because she did a lot of good, but it came at the expense of a lot of people and their lives and what that meant. And I don't have answers. I just have struggles and thinking right now.
Thanks, Aviva. Other thoughts that folks want to share right now? I got lots of questions. But hey, Kelly.
Hey, everybody. I'm Kelly Farmer, and I work at Johns Hopkins University at the Carey Business School. And what Marissa said earlier resonated with me as a white woman watching this story, because I was also kind of ashamed not to really know this story. But what stuck with me is what I did know. And what I did know was the phrase Central Park jogger. I didn't know the story. I don't think I had contextualized in my mind who the Central Park jogger was or what that was about, but it struck me that I grew up a white woman in a suburban neighborhood, and I knew the phrase Central Park jogger, but I didn't know any of the rest. And that got me pretty emotional watching it. And then the other thing, which Belinda touched on, but for me in reverse, is as the mom of just, one white daughter, I thought, how much do I not have to explain to her? How much privilege does she have? Which I know, but when you watch the stories of these boys, it just really hits you in the face. How privileged she is and how privileged I am not to have to explain the kind of trouble that she could find herself in through no fault of her own.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm kind of interested to hear from folks, like, as you were watching the series, like, at what point of entry did you see sort of race and class coming into the picture? For me, I saw it pretty quickly, but I just wonder, like, how other people perceive that.
I guess I'll just chime in. Hi, I'm Alan Durang. I'm at the Benjamin School in Palm Beach, Florida. I don't know if everyone can hear me. I think to answer Brandy's question, I think it as soon as you watch episode 1, you immediately get shown where the divide is. But I think episode 3 hit me more than any other episode, because I think when you start to look as these guys become men and come out of the prison system in some capacity, either on parole or in whatever shape they're basically trying to get out of the system. I think Raymond Santana, his situation is just exactly what they talk about with this institutional machine that is the corrections system. The fact that the other men may have had the access and ability from a family standpoint to kind of help them, get back to some sense of normalcy. But Raymond went back into a broken home and in a situation where his father's basically trying to make ends meet. And it's the same situation he was in when he was a kid going into this process. And Raymond is just a reminder of so many, people of color that don't have, the education that Brandy was talking about, how education is so much powerful in this process, that, the dad is trying to make ends meet. He's trying to do everything. And to have Raymond go back in as a result of the fact that he's he's basically trying to do whatever he can, and the system's already built against him. Like, he can't find a job, and that's the part that really got me so angry. I started looking at it, and I'm just like, this is exactly how people with desperation and despair get so angry and frustrated, because they can't. They talk about a correction system, but there's no way to make that correction, or if it is, they make it almost impossible for it to happen.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be called correction. It should not. What it is, which is modern day slavery.
Absolutely. Right? It's totally not. There is no correction involved, because at the end of the day, the system's rigged so that it's almost impossible for him to get out. It literally has to be a sacrifice from somebody else to help support him to get to where he needs to go in order to get out of the cycle. Thankfully, Yusef, Kevin, and Antron, they had strong women in their lives that basically, could help them, especially Yusef. Like, you saw the education. And unfortunately, even that situation, his education couldn't get him out of this situation. But you saw how quickly he was able to rebound to some extent and be a support for Antron, and eventually for Kevin. And it's one of those things where you see that, and you're just like, so many men and so many people of color don't have that access, don't have that the ability to rebound from a situation like this. And it just, unfortunately, and I remember going into a session at POCC this past year. There was a great psychologist who came in from the Baltimore, Maryland area, and he talked about the institution of the correction system and how it's built like this, where it's just mass incarceration, and it's a vicious cycle that nobody can break the wheel out of. And he talks about, the fact that it's a business like everything else. And that's the majority of the motivations behind Linda doing what she's doing. Be damned to all the things that happened to the gruesome activity that happened to that woman to get raped in Central Park. I think it had more to do with the fact that she is a part of the system that is basically more involved with trying to put money in prisons than they are in schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I kept going back, like, as I was thinking about particularly Corey, right, and his like how he struggled to read, right, and that scene where he was on the stand, and my heart just dropped, right, because I knew exactly where they were going to turn that conversation. But one thing we talk about a lot at my high school is third grade reading levels determine where prisons are going to be built. At third grade, it is determined whether you're going to be something or you're not going to be something. Mm-hmm. And I think plenty of parents have no idea, about that. And I just think it's just this idea that a lot of people assume that everyone has the same privilege and everybody's starting the race at the same point. And that's just not true. I'll never forget when I worked in admissions at Emory, we did the cross the line, activity about sort of where you can join with people to see sort of what obstacles and challenges you've had or what opportunities you've had. And one of the questions was make 5 steps forward if you grew up in a house that had 50 books or more on your bookshelf. And the only person who moved 5 steps was our dean. That was the only person. And there are some people in that room who are educated. I mean, I grew up going to the library with my grandfather, but like I didn't grow up with 50 books on the bookshelf, right? So it's like knowledge, like there's this general assumption, like the kid goes home after school and the kid is in a safe place and the kid has parents who are teaching. Like, yes, sometimes that's happening, but sometimes that's not happening. And when it's not happening, it's not always necessarily the fault of the parent, because some parents are working 2 and 3 jobs trying to do the best that they possibly can do by their kids, but they're also trying to fight a system that was never designed for them to navigate. And I think that's what's hard.
That was one of the most striking moments for me in that first episode, although I think the first episode, the whole thing was so gut-wrenching. But when that dad was so desperate and he just, the cops were like, what, well, you don't know where your kid was? What are you too busy doing? I was working. I have to go to work now. I'm going to lose my job if not. I'm like, I can't leave my mother. Like that moment of that desperation, it's not unusual. It's not unexpected, but that was so raw and so painful. And I don't know, that struck me so much.
It seemed like it was painful, Marie, to watch that, because then you're seeing it not just, we know there are people who struggle financially. We know there are people who are working so hard to make ends meet, but to see how that can impact, like what that then can turn into for a family, that's what made it so, like you said, so gut-wrenching and so hard to watch. And Brandy, what you were talking about, that statistic about 3rd grade reading level, my husband and I just had that conversation the other day, because it came up in one of his faculty meetings. And, we were just talking about that and how, why aren't schools then putting more money into, into education for students, into reading levels, into, teaching them, giving them the skills they need to navigate the world, and not just, oh, okay, well, this is just the statistic and this is where jails are going to go. Fine, we'll just do that.
Oh, Lucy, I was just going to add to something you were saying, and just in general, there's, and the good thing, or the movie I ended up watching, or the series I ended up watching just before this, that kind of prepped me for it a little bit. HBO did a mini series on the night of, where I really resonated with me even beforehand, without necessarily race, but more from, the background of my parents being immigrants coming to this country, and just seeing how the system basically railroaded this fictional character. It almost plays the same scenario going into this series, which I just think is just, it's incredibly tough to watch, and it's at the same time it's very eye-opening and sober to see it.
Steve Frappier here in Atlanta, and Brandy, that question, my antenna were up on race from the very first moment, because it was Bobby and Antron eating French fries talking about baseball, right? And it was a glimpse into Black fatherhood that we never see. Right. There's always this absent father or something deficient. And it was just this beautiful bonding moment where immediately there was the foreshadowing, like this is a tight bond. And it was a bond. I'd never had a conversation like that with my father. Right. And so whenever I see moments like that, it was just, I'm like, this is gonna be tough. That was the first thing. Like one, we never see enough of this, and secondly, because folks say, there was Bill Cosby, but like that wasn't that kind of conversation at all, right? That Bobby was having with Antron, and then over time to see the devolution of Bobby mentally, physically, there was almost, how it was depicted where, Bobby didn't do enough on the stand, right? In a point where he could have helped Antron more. And all of those layers resonated with me. There was a moment in the precinct where they're throwing around racial slurs, and there's a Latin or Black or Latino deputy, right, who just has this helpless look in the hallway, and it's like that too. Like, so there's so many spaces that we're in where it's like, oh, well, we're diverse, or we have representation, we have people here. But if you're disempowered, you know, to say anything because you know that you're going to lose your job or there's other consequences. So what other people have to endure, you know, in full view. And then we don't get to know Morgenthau as much, you know, but it's clear to me how it was depicted, you know, in the miniseries. It's like, well, you know, Linda Fairstein is Kellyanne Conway.
Mm. Well,
great.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
I mean,
Say
you
that.
know, maybe some differences in you know, why is she the one? Why is she the one? You know, either of them have able to yield that power because they're a trustable white woman, right? And they have their own buy-in into why, you know, the system can continue to be perpetuated. But you know, but I got mad about that because I was waiting for the Trump replays, you know, and then I was mad when I heard that Fairstein in today's time put out her own Wall Street Journal or other publication ad. Like who gets to have that privilege? You know, it's other upper class, you know, it's other upper class white people. Any other race or background, even if you had the money, you wouldn't be allowed to put in your own full page editorial or your own defense.
Yeah.
So,
hi. Hello.
Yeah.
You mind, Steve? Hi. It's Tammy Garnes from Atlanta, but today in New Orleans. And there was someone who a few moments ago said...
Wait, Tammy, where are you in New Orleans? Can I step out the window and wave hello?
I don't know. Can you?
We're close. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm on charters. Okay. Someone a few moments ago said they were having a conversation with their husband and they were talking about why don't they invest more in reading programs in the 3rd grade, and having now served at the cabinet level or at a very high level in 2 inner city school districts in the Atlanta area. One during what we called a cheating scandal, only call that when it's Black people, not when it's in Gwinnett. The nation's largest cheating scandal for public educators, where Black people went to jail for doing absolutely nothing. I sat in on all of their tribunals. I know exactly what they did. One of them was even my child's teacher in the 3rd grade. She's now in school at Xavier in Ohio, thank God, because according to everyone else, she should be a statistic. The reason that there is no intervention is because it's all a part of the system. Why would you intervene and help kids learn to read when it's cheaper just to wait for a cohort of them to drop out at 16? There's no incentive to educating everyone. My mother told me once, I asked her why she didn't go get her master's degree. And she said, because I don't want to be the boss. And she said, you know, some people have to work for other people. And that's just the way society is. And I'm not going to be the boss. Maybe you can be a boss one day. And that always resonated with me because when you look at the hierarchy of, and my kids have gone to a public school and a very different private school, small private school, and back to public school, and one's heading to boarding school. And I will tell you, from the inside out of public education, you don't want to see what goes on. You don't want to know the truth. It would absolutely kill you. What you saw in that series, which to me will go down as probably, it's the roots of our time. It's something that everyone should watch. It's something that in 30 years, if you didn't watch, your kids will, or grandkids will ask you why you didn't watch it. That's every day in the public school system in urban areas. And it starts with little things called tribunals, when you backtalk the teacher in the 7th grade. And then you have to go to a tribunal to explain with your mom, who isn't told that she can bring representation down at the school board central office to try to defend yourself. Or you brought something to school that you weren't supposed to have, or you looked at your phone too many times, and I pull up your record and I can see my kid brought her phone to school too, and she got in trouble but it's not in her record. But the little black boy who sat next to her, his is riddled from the first grade on with all these infractions that he's done, so that by the time he's in the 7th or 8th grade, he's then put into the system, which is education, and we can kind of weed him out at a certain point. Why? Because we got to hit data points. And you can't hit data points when you have disruptive kids or bad kids or kids who can't read past the 3rd grade level. This thing is far deeper and wider, I think, than most people want to recognize. And I was a freshman in college in Arkansas when this happened, in a city that was adjacent to a sundown city, and where they canceled homecoming because I was the homecoming queen. They canceled the parade because I was black, where in 1993, they were still having separate proms. And, oh yeah, I couldn't play the lead in all the shows because the guy they wanted to cast opposite of me was white. So this stuff is not, it's not like it's old. It's happening like right now. And I think one of the things that frustrates me is that everyone wants to look at it and say, oh gosh, I didn't know that was happening. I didn't know that was happening. This shit is happening right now. Like every single day. Like, I don't know what bubble people live in, but I see it. And even my friends of color have chosen not to acknowledge that a lot of it's going on, which is why many of us flee to the suburbs or to private schools or to boarding schools, because that way we don't think we have to deal with the injustices that are going on with those inner city kids. But I think Yusuf proves us wrong.
Yeah. Totally.
It happens to all of us. And, you know, a lot of this is intertwined with poverty, or as much as it is race at times, because coming from Little Rock, Arkansas, I can tell you there are a whole bunch of white folks who've gotten some pretty bad treatment in jails, you know, who can't post that bond, who can't pay the fees that they attach to those bonds, you know, they have to stay. You know, you always wonder, why did they stay over the weekend in jail? It was just a speeding ticket. Because they can't afford to freaking get anybody to put any money up to let them out. Do you know what happens to you sometimes in jail? We just had 13 black boys at our high school where Brandy and I worked together. 13 black boys on my watch arrested in our high school for witnessing a fight in a bathroom. What? 2 found guilty of anything. What am I supposed to do with that?
Didn't even have a prior record.
No. But I remember sitting around the table with my superintendent, and he said, well, the police said that they were guilty. And why wouldn't we believe the police? Yeah. And I submitted my letter of resignation 2 weeks later. Because, I mean, how can you, like, who still believes law enforcement over a mom? Mm-hmm. Or a kid who says, I didn't do it? We do. And it's happening every day. So I challenge people, if you have not spent any time, and I fuss at Brandy all the time, if you have not spent any time in the public education system and you are working with kids, please, like, find a few hours to try to go to your local school board meeting. Ask for open record. They have to give you the records. Ask for the suspension record for your local school district where you pay taxes. Ask for it. And you want it broken down by demographic. You want it broken down by gender and race for the last 5 years at your local high school. I just want you to look at it. And our high school that looks so international and so beautiful from the outside, the one that I promoted to everyone for the last 2 years as the head of communications, our high school, when you pull back the veil, only had Black kids being suspended at our high school and put into for the last year. How is that possible in a school of 2,500 kids? No white kid did anything?
Only one white student suspended the entire school year, y'all.
I mean, how is that even possible? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's like, what Ava did is absolutely brilliant. Now it's like, okay, do you realize that it's still happening every day? Mm-hmm. And how are you going to make an impact on that? It's right in front of you. Everyone has a local school district.
Tammy, could I impose upon you to ask you to post this call to action in Accept to make that post to say,
Sure.
yeah,
That's not a problem to visit. I mean, I'm just a big believer in
yeah,
public school systems, and that's how I was raised. And
I think it's a really, I think it's a really important call to action. I think it's a really important call to action, and it's a great way to remind us of our ability to make change and where we have agency to hold people accountable, and that's really critical. And so if you
can,
that would be really awesome.
I would. Thank you so much, Marie.
Okay.
This is Rhodey Davis. Can I say something for a sec? I'm from Viewpoint School in Southern California.
Sure.
I want to say thank you. Is it Tammy who just spoke?
Mm-hmm.
For sharing that information about what's been going down at your school. And for an action item, it's one of my big takeaways from watching that incredibly powerful, it was so moving, it was so disturbing. Those boys, my heart went out to them. Just the way the attorneys, the Linda Fairstein character and Elizabeth Letter, created that narrative that they perpetuated about the animals, and I mean, playing on the fear it's happening right now with our current presidential administration. And I think the other thing that we absolutely need to do is invest ourselves as deeply as possible in this upcoming election, looking at judges, looking at people who are putting in those positions of lawmaking positions who can start to move the needle on criminal justice reform and mass incarceration reform. It's just, and the education reform piece too, along the lines of what you just recommended. I think we have to try to do something, and one way it seems is try to impact the people we're putting into these elected positions.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Rhodey.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Rhodey. What I just want to say, we're going to still talk for a few moments, but we understand if people need to hop off. And obviously there's a lot to unpack, right? We could probably be here for hours upon hours to talk, but I just think there are probably a few other folks who probably also want to say some things. One thing too that there's something that I didn't write down, but I thought about too that has been pretty profound, and I think this affects us whether we're in a public school, whether we're in a private school, whether we're independent, is that I think a lot about the relationship that Antron had with his father and the hatred that he felt towards his father, right? And I watched the special where Oprah interviewed the cast and the Exonerated Five after, and to see what he is dealing with as an adult, as a grown man with children, it had such a profound impact on me. And while I very much understand his frustration with his father, there's a part of me that also kind of understood where his father was coming from. And I think that is the duality that sometimes white people don't understand, that we as people of color have to walk through the world. In his mind, he thought he was truly protecting his kid, because he's like, the cop is the person of authority. You tell the cop the truth, even if you didn't do it, you do it. You say you did it so you can get out of here and so you can get home. I think at the bottom of his heart, he truly thought he was protecting his child and not hurting his child, because he knew that if he said, the repercussions might have been even greater. And I think, that's important for us to think about. And when we're having discussions with students and with their parents of understanding where they're coming from. And I think about this all the time. I remember being in an independent school and thinking about, my students of color and how very much so they were code switching so much on a daily basis. They didn't even recognize how much they were code switching, not because they wanted to, but because it's a means of survival. We don't have an option. And I think that's what it's been kind of interesting to hear. I think for many of the people of color, even if we didn't know the extent of the story, we knew something about the story, because we have to know when these things happen so we can be prepared, because we have to navigate through a world that was not designed for us. And I think, and it's not about, you know, like, that sucks, but it's just like, that's why I say a lot of times, like, I'm not like yelling at white people. I mean, I like white people, right? But it's just like, Google some shit. Like, I always say, like, Google is free. Like, there, you know, like, we always talk about like imposter syndrome and like the hidden curriculum for kids when they get to college and how they have to figure it out. Mm-hmm. That doesn't just happen in college for students of color. That is a lifelong thing. We have to figure out the hidden curriculum. And so it's, and I think that's part of the reason that Trump is so popular right now. He is working off of the fear that I think a lot of white people have of understanding that, like, now many white people are living in a world where they are not the majority and they're not prepared necessarily to know how to navigate that. Mm-hmm. And so we have to have uncomfortable conversations to be able to get to a point where we can try to make some headway. Other thoughts? Stacy, is there anything you want to add? I feel like you always have super profound things to say.
Okay. Much like everyone else, I had a hard time watching it, and after I watched the first episode, I couldn't even get through the whole thing. I had to stop about halfway through and then take a step away. And then today I was trying to watch the rest of it to prepare for our discussion. But you know, some of the things that were said tonight, I remember I was working with a woman at my previous place of employment. And I'm Stacy Richardson. I work at Georgetown Visitation in Washington, D.C., the all-girls school. One of a colleague said to me, when did all this, and she was a young white woman, when did all this distrust of the police start? I don't understand. And I just looked at her and I said, are you serious? It's always been that way for people of color. I mean, they were the original slave catchers. And so there is no way that people of color are ever going to feel like there is a implicit trust in the police force. And this just brought, you know, everything that happened in that first and second episode just made me sick to my stomach. And I knew the story, but it still made me absolutely sick to my stomach. And I think that everything that happened in this documentary could happen again tomorrow. It happens every day. And it saddens me to know that things have not changed that much.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, in the same way that, you know, when I visited the Anne Frank house, I said, this is one diary. I watched this and I said, this is one case. This is one example, and this is the one we're hearing about. And because it's famous, and because, frankly, because they got out, you know, that they were, you know, that's why it's famous. But that I found myself thinking that there must be, that I know there are so many other falsely convicted young people whose stories we don't know. Mm-hmm. And then I found myself totally overwhelmed by that thought.
So, Lisa, when people ask me about like what I'm doing next with Accept and am I staying in New Orleans, I was like, absolutely, I'm staying in New Orleans. But sometimes one of the things I share is because at a minimum twice a day, I have to drive past Orleans Parish Prison twice a day. And when I say drive past, I mean up close, like right up to it. It's in the center of the city. It is the nation's largest urban jail system. It is considered a crime against humanity. It's such a bad system. And it is under a mile from my house, which is one of the nicest neighborhoods in New Orleans. And every day when I drive past that twice a day, I look at those young men and they're almost all Black. And this documentary reminds me, every one of them has this story. Like all of those thousands and thousands of bodies in that decrepit fucking system. They have this story and it's sickening.
I think one of the things, I just got to jump in right quick, Brandy, I'm so sorry, because you know I'm a history person. This is what it looks like when you deprive people of their knowledge of who they are. So I just want you to, like,
Mhm.
if you're working inside of everything you see happening, at least to who are not immigrants, who are Black, whose ancestry dates back to enslavement in this country, through emancipation, through Jim Crow, through redlining, through all of it. It's all rooted in the fact that we were starved of any knowledge about who we are. When you empower people, I mean, that's how slave masters kept people down. You can't read, except for the slave Bible that they gave you that cut out all the bad stuff that they didn't want you to see, the good stuff. And you weren't allowed to know anything about your roots. They took your name first. I mean, you're down here, Marie. You see it. You go out to Whitney, you go out to any of the plantations at any time. The first thing they do is take away your name. They make sure you don't know who you are or where you came from. And I can't tell you how important it is for our kids at the K through 12 level, because in college you can choose what classes you take. But K through 12, I want you to ask yourself, if you're in one of those schools or systems, how many times, how often will a child at your school be exposed to historical facts about African Americans in this country that don't have anything to do with MLK or Malcolm X or done during Black History Month? Like there are so many stories. Just being in New Orleans is just overwhelming. Like this is like a different country every time I come here.
Mm-hmm.
How many times? But I knew all about Anne Frank. I like lived in that. I like loved those stories. I wanted to know so much about the Holocaust. I didn't learn anything about me and my own history and my own family or my own family's names or anything past 3 generations of my family until I researched it as an adult. So for a young Black boy who thinks that his family came from Brooklyn, you know what I mean? Like if that's all you have to hang on to, you don't know your legacy. You don't know that there were 8 generations before you that survived so that you could be here to do the great things that are put upon your life to do. If you don't know that.
Tammy, at the at Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Right camp, it blew me away. In his in the gift bags he gave to kids, included was an Ancestry.com for free. And he said, every one of you, because it was 400 Black kids, he said, every one of you in this room thinks your story started when your people landed on the shores here in New Orleans, but that is not true. You come from Benin, you come from Lesotho, you come from these places. And that, that was exceptional.
In my child's independent school, we tested every single child. Then we had a ceremony. And we called each person to the stage, and the headmaster of our school told every child how they were linked to other children in the room. And every single year when we do that, you know who is a part of your tribe in the room, who you can connect with, who you can go to, who your other family is. There is so much power. But the reason that it's not done, the reason that it's not talked about, because if you do that, you raise an entire race of people up that are empowered, and oh my God, you can't turn off the body cams anymore. So why would you do that? Why would you tell people their history? I mean, why? Why would you teach them in 3rd grade anything other than Christopher Columbus fantasy stories?
I was dissuaded from checking my racial identities because my public school counselor said it would make my life more difficult. Right? You know, and so you just believe the authority figure in front of you. But I had this moment, I'm like, wait, no, you know, and it's the power of those conversations. And I think whatever side of the desk we're working on, you know, having a true conversation, or even if it's, you know, just some way to look at each individual student and to put in, to insist on a curriculum intervention, you know, even if it's in a club activity of some sort. You know, the one of the most difficult scenes for me was Niecy Nash and Marcy. And that just, I had to stop that 2 or 3 times and rewatch it, and just, but the average life expectancy of a transgender African-American woman is 35. And Atlanta has a lot of data on homelessness and LGBT youth, and within of LGBT kids of color that are homeless because they're disowned in Atlanta. Half of them are in jail or juvenile detention within 48 hours. And then what happens from there, and what, in terms of names and who do you go back to? And, and Marcy, I understand could have been a mixture of different characters, but the point's still true that, when there's disownership and identity, and then especially in the late 80s, and all the fear attached to that this assumption that, there's this binary set of, okay, this is us versus them. But then even within one's own tribe, there are other constructs put in place, and that we need to be aware of that as we're taking care of all students, that who just being themselves can have these consequences. And but hearing from her and what she had to do to her character to make ends meet, just all of that, that's the toughest part for me. I also go back to, if it's the Fairstein thing, why was it that it was a white woman at Kavanaugh's hearing serving as the buffer between the panel and Christine Blasey Ford, right? We can go as if we're looking at history or current events, think of the moments where there's a white woman going in. So, Kenneth, thank you for joining in and for pinging us. So anyway, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's just that there's so much that we all have to unlearn, right? Like, whether you're in an independent school or whether you're in a private school, I think we've all been taught to believe narratives about where we come from. And the reality is there are a lot of untruths. I mean, I used to be that kid in elementary school. You could not tell me Columbus Day was not popping. Like, I mean, why would I not think Columbus Day is popping? And so these narratives that we teach kids, and sometimes they're just small things that have so many unintended consequences. I was thinking, and I've said it, and people like in the school have like looked at me like I was crazy, with the exception of Tammy, who's like, yeah, girl. Our bell in our school, when it changes from block to block, this year, we changed it from being a traditional bell to our librarian, who is a white male, his voice. And it says, you are now moving from 1A to 2A. When I heard it the first time, I was like, it's literally like you're moving prisoners from one cell block to another cell block. And when you treat children like they're prisoners, like they're caged animals, guess what? They start to believe that shit. And it's just like, at what point are we going to give kids a little bit more credit? I mean, I think most of us work with young people because we generally like them more than most adults, right? But we don't give them credit. And I think that is what's so frustrating, because it's like, you can't continually poke at somebody and say, you're not this, you're not that, you're not this, and not expect that at some point they're going to buck back and say, I'm not. Either they're going to say I'm not, or they're going to buck back and say I'm exactly who you think I am. And so I just think we have to think so much more thoughtfully about the power of our words and how, what we speak into young people, just because we don't even have a choice anymore. It is literally a matter of life and death for so many of our students. And I just think we have to try to think about that. before I check to see if there are any last comments, I hope that it's also not lost on you all that today is the eve of Juneteenth, which Juneteenth was when slaves in Texas 2 years later found out that they were actually emancipated. And I have had this overwhelming feeling all day that how crazy it is that Juneteenth is tomorrow, yet I don't know that I feel fully free in 2019. And that's a little crazy to me. Any last comments from anybody?
If no one else says, I'll jump in really quick, but I'm gonna hang on first.
To your point, Brandy, I think a lot about how the Jewish community has ritualized certain things like Holocaust Remembrance Day, and how what we can all do to promote Juneteenth as a day to remember both the celebration, but also the pain and enduring pain of slavery within the country. So it's hard because it's the timing of it. Most of us are not in school anymore. I don't know. I mean, we're not in school, but I think to create that ritual around the day and to promote it will go a long way towards making it a ritual. For
sure.
One of the things that one of my personal calls to action.
You're on mute, Marissa. Okay.
Sorry, I work at the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. I forgot to mention that earlier, but I previously worked in public schools in Atlanta and New York, and it didn't occur to me until one of my colleagues last year, who's a person of color, said that a lot of the students that have been admitted into our higher education scholarship program they may check the box that they're Black, African American, but most of them are first or second generation immigrants, and that we actually have very few. In fact, like one cohort, we had one African American male in our scholarship program that was not an immigrant. And it honestly never occurred to me that was a distinction. And hearing Tammy also talking about our system and the institutionalization and the system that's just set up against these marginalized brown and Black boys, I think it's definitely something that I'm thinking about how I can do differently in my work, and in hope that in each of our spaces that we can be a little bit more mindful and aware of the things that we may be a part of that we may not even realize no one has said anything about it, and we haven't really taken the time to notice before. So thank you for facilitating the conversation, and hopefully it's just the beginning.
Thanks, Marissa. Any other comments? Hey, Chris, I just saw you pop up, sorry.
So one thing that I wanted to bring up, I put a link twice into the chat group that's from Vice. And as I was finishing this show again, I was reminded of a young man named Josh Williams, who I've never met in person, with whom I've only had a couple of phone conversations, but is a remarkably important person for Accept, because he is, as much as any one person is the inspiration of all of this, it's Josh. He was a young protester in Ferguson who was one of Mike Brown's closest friends, who didn't leave Mike's body's side for those 4 hours that he was left in the street by the St. Louis cops, who walked and protested every single day. And like many teenagers, made a 17-year-old teenage boy mistake that he acknowledged and is now serving 12 years without parole in the Missouri system so that they could prove a point. And it was becoming friends with Josh and his mom that showed me the power of the skills that we get in this profession and how it's applicable to supporting protesters and activists, and especially the young people in our care. So for everyone who felt touched by the story, who, when you look at those young men and you see your family, your friends, yourself, your students, whomever, think about Josh. There's an article that I posted about him in a way that you can be in touch with him and say hi. But he's a kid who is living this every day, and without him, accept wouldn't be a thing.
Yeah. And I just want to say too, because I don't know that we like say this enough, but obviously we have people who are very like vocal and accept. But I appreciate that, but I also want to say like thanks for the people who like, you may not always say something, but you're listening and like you're taking it in and you're trying to apply it in your space to do this anti-racist work and to be more inclusive. Like I just want to say thank you. I think, you know, in our profession, introverts and people who are quiet don't always necessarily get the most attention, but I do want to say thank you for staying in the conversation and you just engaging with the material in a different way. And I greatly appreciate that. So I think Stephen, Marie agree with that as well. So
can I raise my hand?
Yes, Chris.
One thing. I came in half an hour in. I had a question that relates to how in using this, you know, Tammy talking about how wanting everybody to see this and having this be something that our whole generation or, you know, community really sees, and implementing this in the school, recognizing that it's like a mature rating on Netflix, and that some people, you know, it's obviously going to make people uncomfortable. What's the best way to try to introduce a conversation around this miniseries, recognizing for some people it's super difficult, for other people it's like I can watch it. But I think for my community, I already emailed it out to a couple of my faculty members to say this would be great to have the conversation. As you guys know, this is something that I'm passionate about, to see where this conversation might lead and if this is something that our students are also watching, because we're sure that our students are, but in terms of having it be a sanctioned event or something that we could have a discussion about once school starts again, I think that I'm already starting to generate some of those ideas of how this conversation or this miniseries allows the conversation to form, and was curious if there were people who are already thinking about doing something with this with their students or their staff.
Great question.
They probably are now, Chris. I have somewhere tucked away bookmarked, I think, a couple of different curricular guides and discussion guides that different educators have put together for this. I will dig and find and post. Yes.
Ava actually put one together herself. She has an education component that she tries to do with most of her films, like Selma and The 13th, and Now When They See Us. I was just trying to look it up, but I know that she's done it, and it, I believe, is now available to anyone. You can download the guide that they put together to walk people through it. Now, they are not a school system, so paring it down for younger grades. This would be a hard one, in my opinion, to deliver to people in mass. I know of a group, I witnessed a group of people who had prepared themselves for it, who watched episode 4 together recently, adults, mostly African-American adults. And it was not a good look afterwards. There were a lot of people who were extremely upset. One person who actually left, who couldn't continue the conversation. They were so distraught. So that's a hard one. I think you can teach components of it, but like watching it as a group, my 14-year-old binged it the night it came out, didn't tell me. I thought she was crying over some romantic Korean pop movie, something. And she was crying, and I was like, oh gosh, here she goes again. And then I find out I was watching it in my room, she was watching it in her room, so we both watched it. But my college freshman couldn't bring herself to get past the 3rd episode and is still struggling to get there because she's just at a different place. So I think watching it as a group, I just saw people watch it as a group, and the exonerated 5 were there. And so I think that added to it. But I just think people are going to have a really hard time watching it in mass. I think it's almost a private kind of viewing that you talk about afterwards, not necessarily as you could do excerpts, but I don't know about showing younger students or even high school students it all at once, because once you show it to them, then they have to go and deal with the emotions that come afterwards, like we've been dealing with. And I just don't know if most of our schools are prepared to give the kind of support that would be needed to be given afterwards. I'll just be honest with you. I don't trust most schools to give the type of support that would be needed afterwards for kids who might need some serious counseling and emotional support, especially if you're dealing with the 3 Black kids at the such and such school in that class. You know what I mean? Like, at my old school with Brandy, folks will start, it'd be a protest afterwards because there's just enough Black kids to do that. But, at other places, but she does have a curriculum. I'm sorry, I just went too long. She does have something online. You can download it and try to use that to teach it to kids. But I just watch people. Yeah, I just watch people get very traumatized when they watched it in a group setting.
Chris, I'm wondering, if you were at Cistercian or the place prior when 13 Reasons Why came out and that had a MA rating, but there was such high demand for schools to show and consume and process clips of 13 Reasons Why. So for a similar rating, but perhaps even more uncomfortable content, that'll be a rhetorical, that I'm going to be bringing up, because that's something that there were, oh, well, it's about the rating. It's like, well, it was about the rating this other time, but certain school systems and groups were able to overlook it because knowing about suicide and rape and those topics will save lives. Well, how about our non-white students knowing their rights to save their lives? So I'm curious about that. So I'm glad you brought that up, Chris.
All right, we're really going to let you guys go. Please, feel free to reach out to any of the 3 of us to share any feedback. This is the first time we've made a go of this, so we plan to do more of these and are always looking for ways for people to connect. So please feel free to send
including ahead of our 3rd birthday coming up in just a few weeks. We're going to try to do something ahead of that. So
so be out on the lookout for that. So thank you guys so much for taking out time, and let's just continue to keep doing the work.
Thank you, Brandy.
Bye.